In this video, I'm going to go through what I believe were the highlights of the Tenet Fintech Q2 conference call that happened on Monday, August 29th. I've made a previous video from what I learned about their MD&A, so I'm not going to repeat anything that was in the MD&A. So I've only picked out a few things I want to talk about: the prospectus and uplisting, Canadian operations and expenses, and then I summarized other tidbits I found interesting into a timeline. I think it's a good exercise for anybody as an investor to go through a conference call on earnings and synthesize things and put them together. So that's one reason I'm doing this video, and hopefully it helps you. From a disclosure perspective, I do have a little over 25,000 shares of Peak Fintech. It's something I'd view as a bit more of a riskier investment. I think this one could really pay off and be a decent sized small mid-cap company, or it's one you have to accept could go to zero, depending on what happens with the company and their ability to raise money and their ability to execute. So in terms of the prospectus and uplisting, we should be getting some information fairly soon. Johnson Joseph talked about there being a delay due to the board of director changes. I am guessing that the underwriters probably wanted change in the board of directors, and that slowed down both the uplisting and probably stopped the prospectus. So they have those two new board of directors. So he said that the prospectus and uplisting should be coming in the next week and a half. Or he said possibly in the next few days. So sometime this week to the end of the first week in September would be the timeline that he gave. He also mentioned we should be getting much more news once the prospectus is all done. They really need this capital to grow their company, so it's hard for them to talk about future growth without having this capital to grow the Canadian and ultimately the US operations. So in terms of the Canadian operations, there was a question about the costs of the Canadian operations. Now, unfortunately, Johnson Joseph did not answer this question at all. It's kind of the second conference call in a row he didn't answer a financial question. It was a cash burn question on the previous conference call. So nothing directly there. We know it was a little over $5 million was the Canadian cash burn this quarter. So we're going to have to piece things together from other comments a little bit. He did talk about them being not profitable in this year or most likely next year. Not surprising at all. We'll barely have revenue this year. I'd be quite happy if it was profitable at the end of next year. We got a lot of clarity or information on staff. They were down to 3 or 4 staff in Canada at this time last year. They said they had 50 staff in Canada at the end of the quarter in June, and that it has now increased to 60 between the Montreal and Toronto office. A little more detail was given on the staffing. They had 42 at this point last year, and they're now up to 135. So still more staff in China than there is in Canada. So doing a little bit of guesstimates on staffing, their current costs that we're told was $5 million per quarter is what they just had in quarter 2, and we know they've gone from 50 already to 60 staff. So that's an increase of 20% in terms of Canadian staffing. So 10 more divided by 50. So if their costs increase by that same ratio, salaries, square footage, and office, that $5 million per quarter plus another 20%, and that'd be another $1 million. So on the low end, not counting future growth, we're probably looking at $6 million per quarter in Canadian Canadian expenses, and I would certainly expect this to be low. They'll probably hire more people, continue to increase costs. So it could be, let's say, use a $7.5 million per quarter. That's $30 million per year. So that probably gives us a good idea of what they need to raise in the prospectus at a minimum. Now, hopefully this number will start dropping by maybe Q2 next year as revenue ramps up significantly. Pretty hard to project revenue from the Canadian hub at this point. They talked about a new cubular website coming in design, and we didn't really get any details on metrics. They kept hinting about it, and hopefully we'll get some information post-prospectus on exactly how many sign-ups they've had on the hub. So last, I've tried to take some tidbits and turn it into a bit of a timeline. What we know is in September we should get the prospectus, see how much money they're raising and at what cost, and what the warrants are like, and get the Canadian uplisting. If you're interested in Tenet Fintech, you may want to look at that prospectus and whether your broker can let you get in on any stock. I'm with Quest Trade, and I once got a little bit of stock on a small company, and it came with a little bit of warrants. Then we know for sure in November we're going to get the Canadian hub opening. The new cubular website will be running. They'll have that November 30th Montreal opening. Then I'm guessing a little bit on the timeline. Johnson Joseph talked about in a couple months, so I'm calling that 2 to 3 is my definition of a couple or several. The US hub should open, so I'm guessing March. That's why I have the question mark, and then he said a few months later the European hub, so that would put us into July. Things tend not to happen faster than people plan. That's a reality often in business, so these are probably the earliest timelines. He did talk about having several US offices open next year with an S for plural. So we'll see when that happens. I don't know. There was no comment of whether the US hub opening and US offices opening happen at the same time or not. He just gave the 2023 time frame for the offices. So the interesting part will be post-prospectus. What do we get for news and information between now and November? So that wraps up what I wanted to highlight, and we'll see what comes in the coming days, uplisting prospectus-wise. Hopefully this video was helpful. If it is, please consider subscribing. I'll keep doing these updates if there's enough interest, and like the video if you found this useful.